time, so we'll be as quick as we can go. In preparation for this Q&A, I was reading your book, Memoirs, and came across a quote that I'm not sure if the slides are ready, but I came across a quote that from a letter you received from Joe Clark in 1984, and I think it's quite prescient for today. And it goes, recent global economic developments that challenges the free trade, the pace of technological change, restructuring Western economies, and the emergency of the new Japans point to a future in which the importance of the U.S. relationship will increase, not decrease. We have been driven still closer to our neighbor by factors we have difficulty controlling. Protectionist sentiment today is strong and likely abate for the foreseeable future. It's the single most immediate threat to Canadian prosperity, whether we are intended target or not. So I think if you take out the word Japan and maybe replace it with China and India, that quote is still very relevant today. So when you read that now and you think back to 1984, are there any lessons that we can draw upon for today, given the context historically?
Well, yeah, I think some of the things I just mentioned in my speech are important. Look, Prime Minister's got two important files on his desk: national unity and Canada-U.S. If he gets those right, he's going to be reelected and remembered. If he messes those up, he's got a real problem in history. I watched, in fact, I had a little bit to do with it, the Prime Minister's trip to Washington in February, I think it was. And we saw how well that went. But as through a fluke, and as luck would have it, he went there on a Monday, the Prime Minister. And Mila and I happened to be having dinner on the Friday, 4 or 5 days later, with the President and Melania at Mar-a-Lago. And as he sat down at the table, the President said to me, "You were right, Brian. I got along great with Justin, and I think that we can do marvelous things together for our two countries." So I urged everybody, you're getting it right from the horse's mouth. You don't have to figure out what the reaction was. That's it. And because as we know, whatever Donald Trump thinks in the White House, so does everybody else. No divergence of views. So I think that what we should do is what we've been doing. We keep our heads down and our mouths shut, and we don't take the bait. And we deal with this at the negotiating table. The French always say, "Nous allons répondre avec la bouche de nos canons." But in a peaceful way, that simply means that when we get to the bargaining table, that's the time to make our comments, caustic and otherwise, not now. Who cares what the people say down in Washington? We're not going to win anything. Canada's not going to win a damn thing if we win the war in the Washington Post. We are going to win when the Prime Minister puts his John Henry on a NAFTA renegotiated treaty. Why? Because there's gold in them thar hills. There is, as we've shown for the last 30 years. And so, as I say, I'm confident that that's going to happen. And so there have been no real changes from Joe's excellent letters many years ago.
So I want to pivot to something that you had referenced and talked about in your speech, which is, and Susan talked about this in her intro, which is the engagement that you have with the current government. And it's virtually unprecedented in our history. I don't think we've ever seen anything like it. And I think that's a good thing. And so if we were to ask Brian Mulroney in 1984, would he work with a Trudeau, what would the answer have been?
And I thought he was a friend. Look, I've known Justin since he was 2 years old. And I signaled publicly 3 or 4 years ago when he became leader of the party. I warned the Conservatives, Be careful, don't underestimate this guy. There's a hell of a lot more there than you fellas give him credit for.
How would you describe your role with the current Prime Minister and his administration? Are you a mentor? Are you a coach?
No.
Are you an advisor? How would you?
I'm a guy who, from time to time, because of my association with America over the years, has been asked for some opinions and some advice. But I'm not anything like that. I'm kind of like a dollar a year man. And somebody said they're probably going to get as much as they paid for, you know. So no, I just help out when I can. I said publicly, look, I've learned this. There's no conservative way to negotiate a comprehensive free trade agreement with the United States. And there's no liberal way to do it. There's only a Canadian way. And so I think there are times when political parties should lay down their arms and support a national initiative. This is one of them.
So just to pull on that string a little bit, Rona Ambrose, in her role as interim leader, was very much above the fray on the trade issue in her comments. Do you have any comments on her performance as leader and any advice to Andrew Scheer to be part of the Canadian team as we begin this process of negotiation with the United States?
Well, look, one day I was in a conversation with, I told Rona that I thought she was doing the right thing. And I'm in the conversation with Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law. He said to me, by the way, Brian, we were very impressed that the conservative opposition, the official opposition, has given its full support to the Trudeau government in the negotiation of this. So I called Rona right away and said, you see, and the Prime Minister, of course, knew it and appreciated it. We're going to need all the help we can get. And I think she did the right thing. I think she served Canada very well. She's a remarkable young woman, and she did very well. And that was one of her achievements, to depoliticize something which is already tough enough for Canada. Listen, we're going up against a giant. This is no piece of cake. I mean, in our case, this was a near-run thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, I can remember, well, Derek Burney, who was there, was down in Washington heading, with 8 other people, heading our negotiating team, and we're in the crunch. At the last minute, we were going to lose fast-track authority at midnight, and here we were at 10 o'clock at night. And Baker calls me. He's the chief negotiator for the Americans. And he said, Prime Minister, I got bad news for you. And I said, what's that? He said, we've got a wonderful deal here, but I can't give you the independent dispute settlement mechanism that you want, because the politicians here from the House and the Senate are insisting that would influence and vitiate the effects of a constitutional provision that gives Congress full sovereignty over international trade. I said, well, Jim, I'm really sorry to hear that, because I'm now going to call President Reagan. He told me he was going to be at Camp David. So I'm going to call him, and I just got one question for him. So Baker says, what's that, Prime Minister? I said, I'm going to say to him, Jim, Ron, I'd like to know why it is that the United States of America can sign a nuclear reduction treaty with their worst enemies, the Soviet Union, and they can't sign a free trade agreement with their best friends, the Canadians. Now, it was widely known in Washington that the last thing anybody wanted was to have Mulroney alone in a room with Reagan.
Why was that?
Well, because as Colin Powell says, the old man would give him the roof off the Capitol. So, I mean, it was like the Berlin Wall. They kept me separated all the time. And so Baker says, can you give me 20 minutes? And I said, sure. What I'm about to say now, I didn't witness. I got it from Derek, who's right there. 20 minutes later, Baker goes into the room there and takes a handwritten piece of paper like that, and he throws it on the table to the Canadian delegation. And he says, there's your goddamned independent dispute settlement mechanism. Now, can we get this thing up to the Capitol by midnight when we're going to lose fast track? So there you go. These are, we have to be, Canada is not as big, but we've got the capacity of language. And one of the important words for the negotiators from Canada is no. No. We're not some pushover little country here that someone's going to ambush. We have a $2 trillion economy almost. We have $2 trillion with 36 million people. The Soviet Union has $2 trillion with 138 million people. Hell, the Americans should be more fearful of us than Russia. I mean, so we have the strength to say no, and we have the strength to call, as I said, who in his right mind would not want to sign and indeed amplify the provisions of this gold mine that we all have going for us, namely NAFTA. But, you know, we have, I'm sure, as I said, I'm sure that the team that the Prime Minister has put together is strong and able and effective, and they're going to do a good job for us.
So on NAFTA, I think it's a good segue into something I want to talk to you about, which is, 30 years later, as an architect of the agreement, in the U.S., the political discussion is not a Republican versus Democrat or left versus right. And you talked about this in your speech. It's Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump and Robert Reich, for example, are all on the same page when it comes to trade. And you're either for it or you're against it.
Yeah.
And so first question is, as an architect of the agreement, I think the motivations for a lot of these quotes come from the forgotten American, and President Trump campaigned on this in the last campaign. Did you see what was going to happen, or did you have any insight or foresight into small town America taking the brunt of what is perceived to be an agreement that's not in the U.S. favor? What are your thoughts on that looking back?
I didn't see the fact that Donald was going to develop this argument and Sanders so skillfully. And that's where some of the serious problems came from. The enemy is not trade. The enemy is technology for them. Those jobs in the Midwest, some of them, sure, they've shifted to China and so on. This goes on all the time. We get companies in and we lose them, and they re-engineered and reconstructed. But the problem is technology. Would you believe that when I was Prime Minister, and I wasn't Prime Minister, I just mentioned this to be certain you understand, it was not 75 years ago. But when I was Prime Minister, there were no cell phones and no internet. Well, look at there was no Silicon Valley. There was nothing except us all stumbling along as best we could. Well, now technology and automation are displacing jobs all over the place, and the challenge is to reconstruct the economy on a more modern and open basis. That's what they're doing. I mean, you can't bring back the past. Mr. Trump is saying he's going to bring back the coal industry. Well, I understand his supporters in West Virginia and Ohio and Pennsylvania and those coal mining areas, but that would be a Band-Aid solution. I hope he gets some more jobs and so on for them, but the answer is not that. It is in a greener economy, and it is in training and retraining of employees to handle new jobs that are being created by the new economy, and that are going to be further created by this.
Why don't you think we've seen this same political dynamic in Canada? I mean, the nature of the free trade agreement has been a boon for the country. Do you think we got the best deal of the three nations? And what role does the social safety net or our social state play in let's say, moderating the opposition to trade? Because we don't really see the same type of comments in this country that around the political debate we see down there.
Yeah, Regan, I think that all three countries did well. Obviously, they did. Mexico, in many ways, did perhaps best of all in some ways, because they were, look, what we did in NAFTA, when George Bush and I met to talk about this,